Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and recently I've been providing some video content that provides some of the historical evidence for the work that we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And my goal in offering this historical evidence is to give parents confidence that what we're restoring and promoting in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is not someone's opinion of what education should be. It's not someone's theory of what education used to be, but is the actual, real, historical Catholic education that was studied and taught and promoted by the saints in church history, demonstrated from primary source materials. If you follow my talks, if you've read the book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, you may know that one of the sources that I refer to quite often is called the Ratio Studiorum of the Jesuits, the order of the Company of Jesus, the Society of Jesus. The Ratio Studiorum is significant, extremely significant, not just because of the content that it contains. It's extremely significant because of its place in history, when it was actually composed, by whom it was composed, for what purpose it was composed, and so on. It's easy to dismiss old Catholic education. It's easy to say, oh, well, that's just medieval. That's that's from the old world before we had all of these breakthroughs in modern scientific thinking and stuff like that. It's easy to dismiss the scholastics. It's easy to dismiss Aristotle and Plato and just say, yeah, well, that was fine back in that time, but this is a new world. This is the modern world. You know, Columbus discovered America. There's all of these developments have taken place. We can't just go back to medieval studies and ignore all of the developments of the modern world. The world has changed. The Ratio Studiorum says phooey to all that stuff. Because of its place in history, its source in terms of who actually put this together and published this, what its role was in the church, and so on. So in this video, I'd like to introduce you to the Ratio Studiorum. You don't have to have any fancy background knowledge of history or theology to follow this video. It's intended for Catholic parents. It's going to be simple to follow along, and most importantly, I think it's going to be convincing and give you confidence that you've got first-hand evidence, primary source evidence, that what we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is what the saints actually did in church history. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at this book, and I'll provide some context and background for you, and then we'll look at a translation of it so you can see the table of contents and what it has to say, and I'll walk you through a few chapters to give you a taste of what the Ratio Studiorum actually reveals for us. So let's take a look. Let me flip over here. You can see here, this is a very old book. It's titled the Ratio atque Institutio Studiorum, referred to in abbreviated form as the Ratio Studiorum. This is the rule of studies of the Jesuit order. If you look down here, you see the seal of the Jesuits. This is a Jesuit book. You can see that it was published in Rome, and down here you can see the date of the publication. In Roman numerals, M stands for 1000, D for 500, so 1500. We then have LXXX, which is 80, and VI, which is 6. So the date of this publication was 1586. Ratio Studiorum, published by the Jesuit order at Rome in 1586. So why does this matter? Why is this so important? There's a number of important reasons. First of all, This book is published in 1586. That's over 400 years ago. 1586. One reason why that's important is because the founder of the Jesuits, which was St. Ignatius of Loyola, one of the greatest saints in church history, St. Ignatius of Loyola died in 1556. 1556, so keep that date in mind. This book was published in 1586. So this rule of studies was published by the Jesuits within 30 years of the death of St. Ignatius of Loyola. This is an early Jesuit rule of studies, published right as the order was growing and taking off, very close to the time of the death of its founder, St. Ignatius of Loyola. So this is not a Jesuit book prepared by some modern Jesuits, running American universities in the 21st century. This is the idea of education that was possessed by the minds of the saintly founders and early members of the Society of Jesus, only 30 years removed from the death of Ignatius of Loyola. That's reason number one why this is important, to see when this was published and to see that this was the mind of those early saintly Jesuits with regard to education. Secondly, 1586. The Protestant Reformation began in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door in Germany. So this is 70 years after the start of the Protestant Reformation. 70 years after the start of the Protestant Reformation. This is the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. This system of education was understood by these saintly Catholic missionaries as the remedy to the Protestant Reformation. This was developed 70 years after the Protestant Reformation was launched, and that was the mission of the early Jesuits, to fight as a company of Jesus, as a military order in the church, on behalf of the Pope against the threats that were spreading outside the church, most importantly, Protestantism. This system of education was the principal method that the Jesuits used to combat Protestantism. They went out through Europe and eventually through the whole world, and they established Catholic schools that were founded and directed by the Ratio Studiorum, this book. Okay, so it's important to know that it was published within 30 years of the death of St. Ignatius of Loyola. It's important to note that it's published 70 years after the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Thirdly, 1586 is almost a century after Columbus discovered the Americas. So this is a treatise on education, a rule of studies, published in the modern era, where the New World has already been discovered. This isn't some, close-minded, medieval, ignorant worldview that's directing this system of education. This is a system of education being recommended and promoted by saintly men in the Jesuit order who are already aware of the Protestant Reformation. They're already aware of the discovery of the Americas and the New World. This is a modern Catholic educational program being proposed in 1586 for this New World. So this is not some ignorant medieval idea of education. This is education being recommended by Catholic missionaries and saints for use in the post-Columbus, post-Martin Luther world. It's important for us to understand that. All right? 1586, published in Rome by the Jesuits. This is a modern educational program. modern in the sense that it is being promoted after the discovery of the New World, after the launch of the Protestant Reformation, as the scientific revolution is already underway. Another important thing to note, 1586, this is 40 years or so after the Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent has already been convened and published all of its resources. This is a Tridentine or post-Trent system of education being recommended for Catholics. So when you consider all those different things, it's a response to Protestantism. It's a response to the Council of Trent. It's a response to the founding of the scientific revolution. It is published just 30 years after the death of St. Ignatius of Loyola. When you put all those pieces together, you realize how significant this book is in guiding us to understand Catholic education, not for the medieval world, but for the modern world. This is a system of Catholic education for the modern world. That's what I wanted to show you about this Ratio Studiorum. Let me give you one more look at the book. You can find this on archive.org. You can just search for Ratio Studiorum, and you can select a date of publication. It's one of the filters that they give you, and you can select 1586 to see this exact copy. So this is available online, an original book published by the Order of the Jesuits in 1586, teaching their philosophy and system of education. Okay? Now, having looked at that, what I'd like to show you is a translation. You can see here a translation of the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum of 1599, translated into English by a Jesuit, Alan Farrell, who was working at that time at the University of Detroit, and the translation was made in 1970. So what's important about this translation we're going to look at is this translation is made by a Jesuit. It's not made of the 1586 version of the Ratio that I showed you, but 1599, just a decade later. So still early Jesuit document, a translation by a Jesuit in 1970 of the Ratio Studiorum. Okay? So let's get back and take a look at this translation. You can find this translation online if you'd like to get a copy. The best way to find it is to just, in your Google search bar, just type classicalliberalarts.com and then space Ratio, and it'll lead you to a page on the Academy website where you can get a copy of this translation. So this is a translation into English of the Ratio Studiorum. You don't have to sit there and wrestle through the Latin like I did. I was able to find an English translation later, and you can easily move through this and read through it little by little, topic by topic, and find it to be very, very helpful. Now, what I'd like you to see in this table of contents is it simply goes through the organization of the school and its curriculum, how the classes are to be taught, and so on. It gets into all the practical details and leaves us with no mystery. This is why I think it's so ridiculous to sit here and listen to these homeschool gurus and classical school administrators talking about classical education with absolutely no clue what they're talking about, as if these books, these historical resources don't exist. That's what just boggles my mind in this classical Catholic education stuff, is that you have men who are professional educators who will stand in front of audiences and publish articles and write websites and just make stuff up, assuming that no one has any access to real historical proof of what Catholic education looked like in the past. There's none of this Dorothy Sayers nonsense that we find in most Catholic schools that claim to be there's no There's no 3 levels. There's no grammar stage, logic stage, and rhetoric stage. None of that nonsense. What you find in the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum is exactly what you'll see we've established in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Real, classical, Catholic education. So, I can't comprehend morally, intellectually, in any way, I can't comprehend how Catholic people who work in education can look other Catholics in the eye, can look Catholic parents in the eye and tell them this and that is classical education when they have no historical evidence that what they're claiming about historical Catholic education is true. I don't understand. I really can't grasp how professional educators, book writers, curriculum publishers, and I don't understand how for 20 or more years now they've been looking into the eyes of Catholic parents and telling them this is classical education, this is the grammar stage, this is the logic stage, this is the rhetoric stage. Dorothy Sayers said, and tell these Catholic parents that this is Catholic education. I really can't grasp how they've been able to do that. I also can't grasp how Catholic parents have been so naive to listen to these people and never ask for any historical evidence. Just sign their kids up and start parroting all of this stuff with no historical evidence, no proof, just, oh, I heard it from there, I read it in that book and on that website, and I'm just going to start repeating it all over the place, telling it to my children, investing my family money into it, and teaching it to my children, imagining that I'm actually doing something that is historical and Catholic. I don't understand. I really don't understand how Catholics have had the audacity to go out and publish these things or say these things. And I have no idea how Catholic parents who are zealous enough to undertake the work of homeschooling have just imbibed all of this classical Catholic education stuff without ever asking for any proof. How can this possibly happen? One thing I do know is that if you want to know, if you want an argument for why our children need a real classical education, this is why. So that they won't get duped like all these Catholic parents have been duped in plain sight. They haven't started some secret society to spread these ideas. They just publish them in the open. They're all over the internet. No historical evidence, no support for the things that they tell parents, the claims that they make. We should give our children a classical education to protect them from being able to be duped the way a whole generation of Catholic homeschooling parents have allowed themselves to be duped. Here in the Jesuit Studiorum, let me get back over there, we have primary source material that details for us how Catholic schools were established, ordered, and run by the Jesuits in the modern age, in the late 1500s. And I'd like to just walk through some of these things for you. One thing I'd like you to note here is that as the curriculum is laid out in these chapters here, you'll notice it actually starts at the higher end of the curriculum and works down to the beginning. So the lower grammar class is actually discussed last, whereas the rhetoric and humanities classes are discussed first, even though they're the higher end of the curriculum. So it's presented in reverse order. Notice the subjects that are taught in the school. Mathematics, and when you look at mathematics in this book, I want you to see how little attention is given to mathematics in this program. As I said in my video on the destruction of Catholic education by the scientific revolution, the focus of modern schools on science and math is owed to the scientific revolution. It is not a part of Catholic educational tradition. You'll see how little attention is given to mathematics in this program, and you'll see what is actually studied in mathematics. You see they taught moral philosophy. They taught philosophy in general, meaning natural philosophy and metaphysics. Cases of conscience gets more into the religious nature of the schools. Remember, these were run by Jesuits, so they were also sources of spiritual direction for the students. Notice they taught explicitly scholastic theology in the Jesuit schools. The Jesuits were crystal clear. They were working to promote scholastic theology in their schools in 1586 in response to the Protestant Reformation, just as Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius X have told us to do in the 1800s and 1900s. The Jesuits faithfully promoted scholastic theology, the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. You can see that they taught sacred scripture in the Jesuit schools. They taught sacred scripture, and they also taught the Hebrew language for the reading of the Old Testament, in addition to Greek and Latin, as we'll see. So we can see the subjects that were taught, and we can see how they taught them. You can also see down here, we get into detailed practical rules of how the schools were organized and how they were run. The activities the students participated in, the schedule, the contests and games that they used with the students, it's all detailed in the Ratio Studiorum. But what I'd like to look at, I'd like to go down here to this section on the lower grammar class, page 91 in this book. Not sure what page it is in this document, but let's just go find that real quick. Just go along with me here, so another 15 pages or so. Okay, here we can see rules of the teacher of the lowest grammar class. And I'm going to pop myself onto this camera here so we can both talk and read. Here we see the rules for the lowest grammar class. In other words, this is how students started their classical studies in these Jesuit schools. If you sent a student to the Jesuit school, this is where they started. So if you're wondering, I've got a 7-year-old child, 8-year-old child, where should we begin? Here is the answer from the Jesuits in 1586 in the Ratio Studiorum. We don't need opinions. We don't need Dorothy Sayers' ideas. Why don't we just go read from the primary source in English translation for us? Why don't we just read what the Jesuits did? It's right here in front of us. So let's read it together. In the lowest grammar class, the objective of this class is a perfect knowledge of the rudiments and beginning knowledge of syntax. This is the study of classical grammar, just as we do it in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. The class starts with the declensions and goes up to the conjugations of ordinary verbs. Where there are 2 separate divisions in this class, the lower division will study nouns, verbs, the rudiments, and the 14 rules of construction. The genders and nouns from the first book. When it says first book here, it's talking about Emmanuel Alvarez's Latin grammar, which we teach from directly in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It tells you the specific topics they studied and taught in lowest grammar classes to children who are getting started. The higher division within this lower grammar class will study the matter of declensions, the matter of past participles and supines from the first book of Alvarez's grammar, and from the second book, the introduction to syntax, as far as impersonal verbs. And if you look at Emmanuel Alvarez's grammar, you'll see exactly what this is talking about. No confusion at all. In addition to the Latin, they also studied Greek. Right from the beginning, from the lowest grammar class, they also got started in Greek. The lower division will learn to read and write in Greek. In other words, just Greek phonics. The higher group will learn the ordinary nouns, the substantive, and baritone verb. The prelection, that's sort of an introductory lecture that the teacher gave to the students. The prelection, the actual instruction by the teacher, takes in the easiest letters of Cicero, carefully selected for this purpose, and, if possible, separately printed. So, what are the children studying? They're studying Latin grammar, Greek grammar, and they're reading Cicero in this earliest level of studies in the Jesuit school. Cicero, the Jesuits are teaching the children to read Cicero. The lowest grammar class is starting with the easiest letters or the familiar epistles of Cicero. We actually teach this in Grammar 2, in Latin Reading 2 in the Academy. This same thing. But they started right from the beginning with the letters of Cicero. I teach the Gospel of St. John in Level 1 to allow our children to get started. Just because Latin is so foreign to modern families and students, I like to take a little easier entrance into the study. But we get to this same thing in Latin Reading 2, where the Jesuits started with the letters of Cicero. So Latin grammar from Book 1 of Alvarez's Latin Grammar. And if you ask, how do I know it's Alvarez's grammar? Because there are footnotes with this book, and it explains that. So you can look at the footnotes and see that. They taught Latin grammar from Alvarez's grammar. They taught Greek grammar to the lowest grammar class, and they introduced them to reading the letters of Cicero. The Jesuits, the missionaries, brought with them the letters of the Roman philosopher Cicero, and they taught the children in the Jesuit schools to read the letters of Cicero. Not some goofy Latin book, not some Latin workbook. They taught them to read classical literature from the beginning, real Latin from the beginning, just like we do in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Let's keep reading here. Let's go back over to the book. Now, we've got the content laid out in that first paragraph. The second paragraph goes into the detail of how the class was actually run. And let's pay attention to the time that it talks about. The order of class time is the following. In the first hour of the morning, remember, this is all grammar. All of this is grammar. In the first hour of the morning, there will be recitation from memory of Cicero. The children memorized the epistles of Cicero. Recitation from memory and of grammar to the decurions, that is, to student leaders who were responsible for groups of students, sort of a hierarchy of students that were all accountable to the schoolmaster at the top of the hierarchy. So they would break students into groups, set an older student above them, in charge of them, and they would practice their memory work and recite the letters of Cicero with their decurion, who was accountable and who answered to the schoolmaster. They would do written work, which was gathered by the decurions and corrected by the teacher. The teacher assigned exercises to be done as specified below in the fourth rule. So these exercises are not mysteries. This Ratio Studiorum tells us even the exercises that the kids did. In the second hour of grammar, in the second hour, there's a brief repetition of the prelection on Cicero, and for half an hour, explanation and review of new material. Lastly, subject matter for a theme is dictated. In the last half hour of the morning, each division has an explanation and repetition of some matter from its own assignment in the first book. This explanation may be given to each division on alternate days or to both daily. Afterwards, The pupils shall be questioned on all this material by the teacher or by themselves in competition. The kids were always set into contests and competitions to provide morale and to motivate their studies. On days when no new grammatical rule will be explained in the afternoon, each rule is to be impressed on mind and memory for several days together. The morning prelection is to be transferred to the afternoon, the entire last half hour of the morning given to a class contest, some game or competition, or other exercise. Grammar goes on into the afternoon. In the first hour of the afternoon, there is to be a recital from memory of Latin and Greek grammar, while the teacher inspects the marks assigned by the decurions, and for half an hour at most corrects written assignments of the first morning period, or what remains to be corrected from the written homework. At the end there shall be a review of the previous grammar prelection. In the second hour of the afternoon, this is now the fourth or fifth hour of the day where grammar is being studied. In the second hour, syntax is explained in the higher division, and in the lower, the basic rules on the gender of nouns, and afterwards the 14 rules of construction. A little more than quarter of an hour, 15 minutes to 20 minutes or so, is given to Greek. The last half hour is devoted to another competition or to a consideration of something dictated on the rules of grammar. In the first hour on Saturday morning, the matter seen during the past week should be publicly recited from memory. During the second hour on Saturday morning, it should be reviewed. During the last half hour, there is a contest. The same order holds for the afternoon on Saturday, remember, except that during the first hour, together with grammar, the catechism is recited, and this would likely be the Roman catechism, since this is 40 years or so after the Council of Trent. And in the last half hour, the catechism is explained or a spiritual exhortation given, unless this was given on Friday, in which case the time should be spent on whatever was displaced by catechism. And he goes on and on, goes into the exercises, goes into how Cicero should be taught to the children, and so on, down through the end of the content on this first. And this is the lowest grammar class. Hours and hours a day of study in grammar. Saturday, keep on going in grammar studies. When we ask the question, how much time should our kids spend on these studies? This is our historical answer. How did these schools produce such great scholars? They didn't study 3 hours a day, 180 days a year, Monday through Friday. We have to accept the reality that we do not do as much work as Catholics did in the past. We don't run schools like Catholic saints did in the past. We don't teach our children like Catholic saints did. We don't study like Catholic saints did. It was very, very different. And the results that we have, the fruits that we have, or lack of fruits, it's not a mystery. We are not doing what the saints did with their students 400 years ago. It's not a mystery. So let's look someplace else. Let's go back a little. Bear with me here as I scroll a bit. Let me find the next section. I'm sorry, I don't have this prepared in advance. Common rules for teachers of lower classes. I'm just going to scroll through this. I want to get to the higher level stuff. Just bear with me here for a minute. Here we go. This is rules for the teacher of rhetoric. Okay, so this is the higher end of the curriculum. Rules for the teacher of rhetoric. So let's see what we have to do in a rhetoric class in a Jesuit school. Notice there's no talk about any stages of learning. There's no grammar stage, logic stage, rhetoric stage. The grammar, logic, rhetoric, and so on are subjects. They're arts. They're not stages of learning. There's no stages of learning here. Grammar is contained in a book. Latin grammar, Greek grammar, they're in books. Rhetoric is taught from a book. The art is studied. It's a separate subject. It's not a stage, some kind of developmental level of learning. Just ignore all of that Dorothy Sayers nonsense. It has nothing to do with real classical education. Let's look at how rhetoric was taught in a Jesuit school in 1586. Rules for the teacher of rhetoric. The scope of this class is not easily defined. Its purpose is the development of the power of self-expression. Its content spans two major fields, oratory, speaking, and poetry, with oratory taking the place of honor. How many schools today are dedicated to speaking, to oratory, to the art of rhetoric in oratory as the more important of the studies? None. The purpose of the formation is both practical and cultural. It may be said in general that this class is concerned mainly with the art of rhetoric, not some stage of learning. The art of rhetoric, the refinement of style and erudition, which is learning, interesting cultural information about classical studies. We'll see that later on. Although the precepts may be studied in many authors, we can learn the precepts of the art of rhetoric from many authors. The daily prelection will be confined to the oratorical works of Cicero, of Aristotle's Rhetoric, and, if desired, Aristotle's Poetics. So, what books did they study? It's not a mystery. It says right there in the Ratio Studiorum what books the students in the Jesuit schools in 1586 were taught. They were taught the oratorical works of Cicero, Aristotle's Rhetoric, and Aristotle's Poetics. No mystery. That's classical Catholic education. Anything else is baloney. That's what the teachers taught. That's what the student learned. They didn't use some goofy workbooks. They didn't use some artificial textbooks made by Joe Schmo. They studied the classical texts directly. Cicero's oratorical works, Aristotle's Rhetoric, and Poetics. That's what the kids were taught in the Jesuit schools. Cicero, and this is referring to their study of Latin, Cicero is to be the model of style, though the best historians and poets are also to be sampled. All of Cicero's works are appropriate models of style, but only his orations are to be matter for the prelection. So the principles of his art may be observed and exemplified in his speeches. In other words, the oratorical works of Cicero were studied, and the schoolmaster was able to point out the principles of the art of rhetoric as they were demonstrated in Cicero's actual speeches. I just published a lesson yesterday where I did this with Pope's translation of Homer's Iliad. This is called rhetorical analysis. The students were led to analyze the works of Cicero rhetorically. Next, erudition is to be sought in the study of historical events, ethnology, authoritative views of scholars, wide sources of knowledge, but rather sparingly according to the capacity of pupils. Erudition here means classical knowledge, classical humanities, just a general sort of learning and familiarity with history, ethnology, different commentaries, other classical sources, and things like that. We'd call that humanities. In the study of Greek, which is, notice that Greek is pursued in the rhetoric class. In the study of Greek, attention should be paid to the rules of prosody, that's grammar level 3, and to a general acquaintance with the various authors and various dialects of Greek. That would mean Homer, who speaks one dialect, it was Ionic Greek. Then you have Aristotle and them who spoke Attic Greek, and then you have the apostles who spoke Koine Greek. So the different dialects used throughout Greek history, the students were to be aware of them. Then thirdly, it says a compendium of logic, which is given to the pupils toward the end of the year, is not to be made the subject of detailed explanation by the teacher of rhetoric. So take this and ask Dorothy Sayers and the folks who promote all of these false ideas of classical education, what do they say when we see the Jesuits introducing logic after rhetoric? At the end of the logic class, the students are given a compendium or overview of the rules of the art of logic. There's no stages of learning. There's no logic stage. The students are studying rhetoric because they're not even into logic yet, because logic is treated as rational philosophy and is to be studied later as a philosophy subject. This whole idea of the stages of learning is not only a bad idea, it's historically contradicted by primary source texts. Isn't that what we're sent to college for? Aren't we taught to do research projects? Aren't we taught to do research and consult primary sources so we don't make false statements with no evidence? Of course we are. The things that these other programs teach contradicts the actual historical sources that we have that tell us what the Catholic schools did in the past. Going on here, it gets into the order of the schedule and day and things like that. I don't want to get into all of that because I'm going to wrap this up here soon. Notice also down here it gets into daily memory work, all right? And it talks about what the students should memorize and so on. Let me scroll down quickly to the next section. In the next section, we see the teacher of humanities. So what I want you to see, and I'm going to move out of this now, what I want you to see is that when it comes to classical Catholic education, there's no mystery. There's no mystery. We don't need homeschool conferences for people to stand around and try to guess what we should study. We don't need to go to some Protestant female mystery writer, which is all that Dorothy Sayers was, and have her tell us what she thinks education should be like and develop some new idea of something called classical education from a source that's not even Catholic, and build whole homeschool programs, whole Catholic schools on a completely false idea of historical Catholic education. Again, I don't know how Catholics can do that as educators. I don't know how you can run with a message that you have no historical evidence for, but they did. I understand how Protestants can do that, but I don't understand how Catholics can do that. But they did, and they continue to do so. We can see here, we have the historical sources that tell us what the Catholic schools did. There's no mystery. There's no confusion. All it takes is for an honest classicist who's willing to actually do some research instead of just publishing his own stuff and promoting his own plan. Just do some honest historical research to find the sources that tell us what to do. There's no mystery here. So I don't understand how these people have published this stuff. I don't understand how people like Laura Berquist and all the other classical Catholic gurus that ran wild in the 1990s and into the 2000s, I don't understand how they did that with no historical evidence for the things that they were saying and telling parents to do. I don't know how Catholic parents allowed themselves to just listen to people telling them things with no historical evidence. I don't understand how people fell for that. But one thing I do know, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we didn't do that. We didn't run with our own ideas. We didn't just push a message and tell people to take our advice or listen to our opinion. We didn't turn to non-Catholic sources for ideas about education, we did the research and we restored the real classical Catholic curriculum. Now, there are some differences in just the practical outworking of things, because our technology is different. We have to deal with a modern educational system that has compulsory rules we have to follow. Our system of college and stuff like that requires some specialized preparation. There are a lot of just practical details that we have to work around. The technology makes things possible for us that weren't possible for them, so we actually have some advantages over the Jesuits at that time. But the content and the curriculum, what was studied, the order of studies, how it was taught, how it was studied, this is all simple, black and white, demonstrable historical information. This isn't my theory, not my opinion. I can show you this. It's in black and white in historical documents. We can go back and look at the translation of the Ratio Studiorum. We can go back and look at the original text published in 1586. This isn't a theory. This isn't just, William Michael's way of doing things. That's not what this is. The mission of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, from the very beginning, has been and always will be to research. This is why we research, so we don't promote things that are just baloney. To research first, to be responsible in our teaching, to restore, not invent, but restore, to publish, that is to make accessible, easily accessible, affordably accessible to students, and the fourth part of our mission, to teach the classical liberal arts, just as Catholic schools throughout history did. Not just in the Middle Ages, not just pagan schools in the pre-Christian era, not just medieval schools, but also modern Catholic schools in the age of the Protestant Reformation, in the age of the Scientific Revolution, in the years after the Council of Trent, in the years after the discovery of the New World. This was modern Catholic education in 1586 being codified and promoted by the Jesuit order throughout the world in Catholic circles. This is the true classical Catholic education, and there's nothing else. There's no other classical Catholic education. It's not, well, you have your idea and we have. No, they can try to say that because they've been caught lying about these things. That's why they'll say, well, that's one opinion. No, there's no my opinion, your opinion. This is historical fact. This is demonstrable. There is one classical Catholic system of education right here in the Ratio Studiorum, right in the works of St. Thomas and other works through history. You read saint biographies, study the church fathers. There is one common tradition that continues all through church history into the modern era and has been inexplicably abandoned by modern Catholics, and the results speak for themselves. If we want to restore Catholic culture, we have to restore classical Catholic education, and we know exactly what needs to be done to do so, and we're doing it in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. We're already 15 years in to this project. And so to wrap up here, I want to invite you to join us in studying in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This is what we're doing. It's really exciting when you go back to the historical text and you say, you read what they're writing about in 1586, that's what we're doing right now in 2022. And it is just as relevant, just as significant, because these are timeless truths. These things don't change. Our nature doesn't change. Philosophy doesn't change. Theology doesn't change. These things are timeless and trustworthy. And that's what we're providing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Timeless, and trustworthy Catholic education. I hope that's helpful. I know it's convincing because it's historical fact. Nothing else to say. I really would love for you to join us and join us confidently in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, because we're restoring classical Catholic education in the 21st century. God bless your studies.